Today's episode is a very interesting topic. It's on how to have a scientific debate. It's an important topic because these days many people have watched science debates in public, but they don't really understand how they work and why we have them. And so there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and chaos. Today's guests are going to help us sort it out. We have my very good friend, Dr. Vanessa Saunders, who is an immunologist, PhD immunologist, and we're so happy to be able to have her on the show anytime. And we also have our very good friend, Dr. Killian Kleffner, who, of course, has been on the show many times and is our resident neuroscientist. So, hi, guys. Thank you for coming back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having us.
I love having you guys. It's wonderful. So, Killian, let's set the table a little bit for the folks at home, and let's talk a little bit about what is the scientific debate before we get into how we have one. So, you want to throw out a definition for the club?
Yeah, so for me, a scientific debate is a debate where you have differing opinions, but it's centered around evidence. So you have some sort of evidence or facts that you can rely on to make your claims and compare them with the opposing opinion.
I think that is a definition that we can all agree on, and I thank you for throwing that out there. Vanessa, what kind of rules do you like for a scientific debate?
One of the main rules that I like is to, when you discuss the science, to be able to have a reliable source. And so that's one of the things that I always, kind of put out there when I'm having a scientific debate. It's here's my source for my information. What's your source for your information? Let's see if we're interpreting it the same way, what the differences are in our interpretations, as to why it's leading to a debate.
So I think that is also the central point for having a debate is a reliable source. And so I'm going to explore that a little bit again with both of you, but I'm going to throw it to Killian because he's kind of quiet over there. So reliable sources. This is an issue I think that comes up. So I have a lot of people, for example, that say to me, "Oh, the COVID vaccine alters your DNA." I have articles, or people will talk about Fauci and his mask recommendations and go, "Well, first he said no masks, and then he said masks, and then he said no masks, and then he said two masks." And I don't think he ever said two masks, but this is the type of discussion that people will bring up to me when we start talking about science and debates. And so I think that it's really important to establish what a reliable source is. In my opinion, a reliable source is one that is credible and that is as objective as possible to produce that evidence. So I like, for example, peer review articles, or if it's the layperson, because sometimes the peer review articles are written such that nobody can read them other than the person who wrote them, which is a whole nother show. But I also like things like blog posts by people who are experts in the field, that we know have at least done a little bit of research on it and are citing those articles in a layperson context. Killian, what about reliable sources? What do you think makes them, breaks them? And what about when science evolves? Because I think what happened in the case of Fauci with the masks is that the science evolved, the evidence evolved, but somehow we didn't communicate that evolution to the public, and then we had a little bit of a mess that we have today. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think there are two things going on there. The first is science is dynamic. So when you're entering a scientific debate, you have to be willing to have your opinion updated, changed with new emerging information, because science is dynamic. People like some concepts will be static, they'll be the same forever, always, right? Gravity is gravity on Earth as it is always, all the time on Earth. But as soon as you leave Earth, right, you need to change your opinion on that one. So some concepts are static, but most of science is dynamic. We're getting new information, we're doing new tests, we're finding the best options available all the time, which is one of the things that I think is really beautiful about science and what makes scientific debates really lively. The second thing is, how do you know if your source is reliable? Well, first you need to know your source. I don't have a problem with somebody saying, I have this article. This article said you should wear 2 masks. That's fine. Show me the article. Let me see where it comes from, who it comes from. Let me see if I can track where they're getting their information to see if it is reliable or not reliable. Now, how can you tell if it's reliable or not? Everybody is going to have different standards on that. Um, if a person has experience with a topic or a degree in a topic, I find them to be pretty reliable sources. But you have to be able to have that measurable, right? If it just has some name attached to it, I don't know anything about their background, I can't call that a reliable source.
I would agree. And you bring up an interesting perspective here because, and I'm going to throw this to Vanessa because you and I have been talking a little bit, but Killian, that's a really interesting perspective. I read an article several weeks ago that basically said people should accept the scientific consensus if they're not an expert in the field. And I thought that that was very limiting to the scientific debate. And I thought that that was a really bad idea. Vanessa, you're in a field. I mean, a lot of people are not experts in immunology, but immunology has really come to the forefront right now with everything going on with the pandemic and the vaccines in general. Like, this has all become a very popular topic the last few years. What do you think about how people can evaluate the scientific consensus?
So I always like to use several sources. So, before it was mentioned peer review articles, which I think is an excellent source. But as you say, they could be a little bit complicated to read. So I also like government websites. And I like sources such as, publications that are from established medical practices as well. So sometimes you have to look for sources that are written for the layperson. I don't think that anyone should just accept anything on consensus. I'm a huge fan of reading. I'm a huge fan of researching information and finding out information and kind of taking your knowledge in your hands. And so I always encourage people to look at multiple sources, to look at the actual, review articles, look at the peer review articles, and then look at the government website and see if you see a contradiction for yourself. So I don't believe in that limiting factor of, oh, just accept it. Sometimes maybe you have to find a source that's a little bit clearer for you to read, a little bit easier for you to read. If you can't read the most current article that's published, you'll have to go to the CDC's website and kind of read what's written for the layperson. But there are sources out there for different levels of understanding.
What do you think, Killian? Same question over to you.
I'm a neuroscientist, right? And I love science. So I'm with Vanessa. I like to know my sources. I like to do a lot of reading. I like to evaluate the information that's out there. But I also understand that not everybody feels that way. Not everybody has the time or wants to dedicate the time to evaluating their sources or looking at differing opinions. So in that situation, they're going to be making more trust-based decisions about what they find to be reliable. So if you're somebody who doesn't want to evaluate all the evidence yourself, it's important to have a few go-to sources that you'll just trust right away. Like, I'm not going to go out and read all of the immunology papers. I'm going to ask Vanessa, who is my trusted source. I'm going to say, Vanessa, I have this question. I don't have time to research it. What do you think about it, right?
I sometimes ask her, even if I have researched it, just because I value her opinion and I want to know what she thinks. So, for example, I sent her an article. Well, it was not an article. That's a lie. I sent her a Facebook post yesterday
Not the
that
same thing.
somebody had sent me, which the person had posted. And then after their post, people started to message me and they said, everybody who gets the COVID vaccine is going to get HIV. And I was like, no, that's not how any of this works. And I had to kind of, calm people down. And so I sent it to Vanessa because, one, I thought it was very interesting to see how people frame science or lack thereof. And what had happened really was people had gotten confused because he had posted a side-by-side comparison of the HIV virus and the COVID virus while talking about vaccines. So it was just really bad presentation in general. But I also thought, like, Vanessa would just get a kick out of it, that it wasn't a rash. It was something about immunology, because I know, Vanessa, you get a lot of weird things sent over to you. But to Killian's point, right? Like we ask you because we value you as our expert. What do you think people really should know about scientific debates and or scientific debates within immunology? Because I too am not an expert in immunology, which is one of the reasons that I ask you so many random questions, and I'm grateful that you come on the show and that you answer them.
So, of late, I think something that's been very important is diffusing the panic that's happening around COVID. So, it's a very dynamic situation and it's evolving all the time. And so, when I get in conversations with people, I have to say, speak to your medical doctor because I am not a medical doctor. And so, when people come and ask me about the vaccine, I always refer them to their physician. But when they come and, like you said, the article that you sent me where they were like, oh, the COVID vaccine is going to give you HIV, sometimes you have to just diffuse the panic, say, let's stop and let's reread this article and look at what it actually does say. And then we can go from there. So I've had those conversations with people who've come to me, and then I've had to go back and sometimes I've even had to highlight parts of an article to say, look, this is what it says, so just take your time. Don't read through all the thousands of comments that are kind of creating the panic that you're feeling. And let's go from there and understand what's actually written. But in general, being able to discuss the source usually always helps with the debate. Even if, you don't want to have to go back and read all the immunology papers, the source that gave you the question that's now being debated on, typically that can lead, to enough information to be able to have a good discussion.
I love that, especially the diffusing the panic, because is there still some panic this much into the this many months into the pandemic? Killian, the panic, is that a neuroscience response to the situation, or is that something else going on?
Sure, fear-based responses to unknown situations, to uncertainty, to fear that you or your loved ones will be harmed in some way is absolutely a neuro response, right? As soon as you get that fear trigger, there's a whole cascade of activity that happens in the brain that causes you to panic. So I think Vanessa is really wise when we're talking about a scientific debate that has that personal meaning where it feels like it's high stakes, is to pause the panic and kind of calm down some of those feelings so that you can engage with the information more rationally, more slowly, and more thoroughly.
Do you have any really good techniques for doing that?
For addressing the panic, depends on how panicked you are, right? Yeah. So I'm a big fan of the walk away for a minute and come back, right? Like set it aside, do something else, and come back to it. That's usually a surefire way that your feelings will change. Of course, in my field, mindfulness is the big go-to right now for managing fear and anxiety and panic.
Mindfulness is really difficult for me. There's a lot of things about mindfulness that are difficult for me, but I think for a lot of people, it's very it's a very good practice for them to get into, especially when it comes to the science, because a lot of times, like I said, they get that little bit of information, and that's all that they need to be off to the races. So Vanessa, I hadn't really planned to do this, but I just think it'd be kind of fun. So don't be mad at me too much for putting you on the spot. But favorite historical figure in science? Who was your biggest influence in the historical figures in science?
Actually, I think so. Funny thing, I think before you and I had discussed it when I was young, I had a chemistry kit, so I have to say like Marie Curie, Madame Curie. She's just did Killian laugh just now?
Yeah.
She's just a favorite, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a good choice. Killian, what about you? Favorite historical figure who influenced you?
So one is going to be the cat, as in cats. So that's my non-human influence, and I'll tell you about that. And the second is going to be a neuroscientist, Dr. Ramachandran, who wrote really great, engaging books about his research on the brain and how the brain tricks us in all sorts of ways, and how we can actually use that in therapeutic contexts. So the cat, because I don't know if you know much about neuroimaging history, but a lot of it is based on animal research, which is not a topic that's very favorable right now. But decades ago, it was fine to do research just on animals. So they would do things like just stick an electrode in animals' brains and record it just to kind of see what happened. So a couple of researchers did this with cats, and we learned almost everything that we know now about how precise the visual system is from an experiment that was not intended to test the visual system, but with cats that had electrodes planted in their brains. So cats thoroughly changed the history of neuroscience.
That's very interesting. I did not know that. So is that how they also discovered? Well, I'll ask that on another show because I just realized we're going to talk about that other topic. So, so
Can I give another one since Killian got two?
of course,
Because I'm a huge fan, even though I don't know if I would call him historical because he's very current right now. But Neil deGrasse Tyson, huge fan of accessibility in science, and I love
Mhm.
the way he just makes science fun and easy to understand, and it's on TV and it's really accessible, and I think he just does a great job with helping get science out there. So
I think he
thank
does too. And I like to think that one day he'll watch this show and he'll be so impressed that we mentioned him on it.
you.
Um, no, I hope that he would, see it one day and enjoy it because I think it's really important. And actually, what's interesting is somebody asked me several months ago if I could choose any career other than what I already do, what would I do? And I was like, I don't know, maybe like astrophysics. Like that just sounds like that might be kind of a fun thing to do. And they're like, all right. So, they mentioned his name. Though I don't know. That's a scientific debate by itself too, right? About Pluto being
Oh
a
yeah.
planet or not being a planet, and the way people hold on to that. And I think he was involved in that debate, if I remember
So
Well,
correctly.
that's a great example of updating definitions, right? So science changed their definitions at that time, and when they updated their definitions, Pluto fell into a different category.
It's true. So my historical figures, since I quizzed you both, and I will also give two. So you both may know that above my desk, I have a picture of Louis Pasteur in his lab and of Joseph Lister performing surgery. And I have these two above my desk because I like to remind myself a little bit of what Killian was talking about science is dynamic, right? And these two men were almost laughed out of their fields at the time for coming up with this, germ theory idea that little germs make us sick, and that Lister for, discovering, oh, if he washes his hands, his patients live longer. In fact, I kind of sometimes think that Lister is an early example of informatics of my field because he was using data to make decisions. And so I have them above my desk to remind myself that science is about innovation, and that it doesn't really matter because these two titans of science were almost laughed out of the field, and yet we have their contributions to thank for so many things. Um, so those are my two. Um, do either of you have any final thoughts you would like to share? I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I just want to give you guys an opportunity to provide any final thoughts that you feel called to do. Vanessa's smiling at me like, no, I don't want to talk anymore. Okay.
no, I think the debates are really important. I know they're happening right now on a very public stage, but on one hand, yes, there's a lot of panic. On the other hand, it's kind of good that people are able to talk about science now. It's kind of good that science is a everyday discussion, and so hopefully, that that momentum keeps going and people remain interested in science post pandemic. So hopefully it just happens. I'm excited to see it happen, and so I'm gonna ride that wave and have as many scientific conversations as I can with anyone who wants to. Um, After I diffuse the panic, if it's about COVID, I'm
Me
enjoying it.
too. Me too, Vanessa. I think it's great. And I want to see like a very strong next generation of science. Killian, any final thoughts?
Yes, I would say in terms of scientific debates, if a question is asked in earnest, if you are earnestly asking a question, there are no stupid questions in science.
Oh, I love that. And I often say that to people actually, because people do get kind of caught up in that.
But it must be in earnest. If somebody's asking a question and it's not in earnest, it's a different story. So it's part of the sincerity, trust, openness in science, right? If you're earnestly asking a question, great, let's tackle it.
Well, that's the foundation of science, isn't it? Really,
Mm-hmm.
science is knowledge, and really asking questions in earnest is what um, moves science forward, I think. Well, thank you both for being on my show. I love the opportunity to have all of my friends on my show, but especially the two of you, because it's always more fun. And you two are so engaging with so many different scientific topics that it's great to have these discussions. So thank you both for being on the show, and I hope to see you again soon.